I gotta get my Brendan voice on. Hold on.
This is episode 26 of the Snapshot, and I am KM Best, joined as always by Marvel Snap phenom Brendan APG. Brendan, your week in Marvel Snap.
Hello, sir. My week in Marvel Snap, that was perfect, by the way, KM.
Yeah, I know. I thought it was really, good.
You really turned on the radio voice there. Anyway, I just finished the Content Creator UK tournament hosted by Kawatek here in Manchester, in the UK. Let's just go to the results. So ultimately, I lost in the quarters. I went 4-1 in Swiss, made it to top 8, lost in the quarters to D-Money. But yeah, fantastic event. Lambie series, previous guest on this podcast actually won the entire thing. And honestly, if you haven't seen the tournament, I know, Cam, you're going to go back and watch it. The semifinals and finals match with Lambie series are some of the best Marvel Snap games you'll ever watch, particularly his match versus Den. Den from Marvel Snap Zone was probably one of the most well-navigated matches I've ever seen from someone that was significantly far behind. Lambie being on 2 cubes at one point, Den effectively 4 games ahead of him, and Lambie proceeds to play the perfect game, play to his outs, and win that entire series. And I think it's one of the best conquest series that's ever been recorded in Marvel Snap history. It was a fantastic match. But anyway, okay, before we get into the tournament, we're going to be talking about the prep, the metagaming, the lists, expected meta, overall tournament, talk about some key matchups, and then, results and the future of this meta. Because I think that the meta that we ended up in at the tournament was maybe a bit different from ladder, not the ladder that you might be playing right now when you're listening to this podcast, but a bit of the ladder of last week, particularly High Evo and High Evo Lockjaw was very much represented at the tournament, seemed to be somewhat of a tier 2 or slightly behind deck. Obviously a bit of subjective there. Before I jump into all of that though, Cam, how's your week in Marvel Snap?
My week in Marvel Snap has been pretty damn good. I'm putting the radio voice back on for this. Since I am in the host role, you are in the guest role now. I have been enjoying my week in Marvel Snap, but the real focus here, as always, is the Creator Clash.
Yeah. So, there's a little bit of news, but we'll probably cover it mostly next week. Nothing too crazy. We had some OTAs hit. Most importantly, Doctor Doom was hit. This is actually right before the tournament, which is a significant OTA. I think it changed. Doctor Doom will still exist in a lot of lists, but lists that relied on only Doctor Doom as top end as a way to spread power and put the opponent in, I guess, sort of a hard situations like, am I committing to a tall single lane or am I spreading power with my Doctor Doom? Now that Spider-Ham has also entered and Doctor Doom is nerfed, it really takes the sort of what was one of the best cards in the format, Doctor Doom. It just takes him down a peg. I don't know if it will be exiting the meta, but with both Spider-Ham being popular and those Doom bots getting slightly nerfed, I think we'll see a bit less Doctor Doom. But yeah, prep for this tournament. And
one thing about Doctor Doom, this actually came up in a game I played. Silk beats him now.
True.
Like, if you're like trying to compete for a locked off lane, Silk is actually going to one up a Doctor Doom bot now.
Yeah, I actually ended up playing Silk in one of my lists. One thing, by the way, I don't know if you have seen the Spider-Ham ridiculous interactions, Cam. So first of all, they fixed him, right? They hot fixed him. They fixed something where basically the pig would cost 4 and it could get discounted by Zabu. You know what they didn't fix? And something that's literally on stream from the class.
Okay, what didn't? Because what they did fix, they fixed it like the most, if you'll pardon the pun, ham-fisted way possible. They made the default cost of the pig 0. So what that means is if you lockjaw the pig, like if you put the pig into lockjaw, you could pull it with Jane.
Well, let me ask you a question.
Shoot.
A question, Kim. A little scenario here.
Yeah.
Your opponent has a 6-cost card. Elysium flips as a location. That 6-cost card becomes a 5-cost card. You play Spider-Ham. It hits what was the 6-cost card, now discosted to 5 to Elysium. How much does that card cost now? After getting hit by the pig.
Is the answer 4?
It's 4.
Yeah, the answer is 4.
Both cards.
No, it doesn't count both cards. The way pig works is it checks current cost every time. So like if it works this way with wave too. Like if you wave something and then pig it, it'll cost 4 even when the wave goes away.
Crazy. So it's
so like with
snapshots.
Elysium, it checks the current cost, which is 5, and then that's how I knew the answer there. Like I actually knew how that interaction worked. Yeah, it checks the current cost when it gets hammed. It doesn't check any base cost or anything. It's just current cost. And then now that thing costs 5 permanently, oh well, Elysium triggers again and it costs 4.
Yeah, not exactly something that I was predicting in this situation. I was like, okay, my opponent has a now 5 cost, what used to be 6 cost, 12 power Hulk, but it's now 5 cost. It turns out it's a 4/12. I'm like, what the fuck is that?
Yep.
Yeah, the pig interactions are are pretty interesting. Cam, I want to get your thoughts actually before we dive into this. The high level, sort of, what is your evaluation of Spider-Ham? Because we actually talked with Molt last week, and we were like, let's just skip Spider-Ham. That card is trash. That card made a bit of. Yes, we absolutely. Well, specifically, you were like trash. Next,
if that's what I did, then I was wrong. But I have a very short memory.
Yeah. Well. Seems like it has made a pretty significant
I still
splash.
can't tell how good it is. Like, everyone is like, oh, yeah, run Spider-Ham and everything. Run Spider-Ham and everything. It's a really strong card. And it's like, it's fine. It's, like, good. I don't know. Like, what are you doing with it? Like, I see people saying, like, oh, you should run Spider-Ham over Iceman in, like, Electro decks. And it's like, I don't think you should, because the whole point of the Iceman in those decks is to beat Lockjaw and Mirrors. And it does that way better than Spider-Ham does. I just feel like people are running it without like knowing why. I feel like there's a lot of that. Like why? Like what is the reason behind why you're running the Spider-Ham? Why?
You're 100% correct. I think that card is completely matchup and sort of opponent deck based. Right? There's a lot of nuance to it. Spider-Ham. On its own, like just hitting a card into your opponent's hand and turning it into a pig, that's like the Howard the Duck argument, to be honest. Like it's not always a good thing, actually. Like, you know, snapshotting the Hulk that had the previous ongoing ability. Like there's so many situations where it ends up just being the same card, like all these Shuri decks that might come out after the Red Skull buff. Like,
yeah, like
Ham is not
good
the
Red Skull and it's like, oh, thanks, man.
Yeah. Where Spider-Ham is really good is, well, in the previous meta, a lot of decks played like only Doctor Doom as top end, or it was like a key top end card. Yes, it would hit that a lot. Even in high Evo Lockjaw, hitting the Hulk early can be significant. But if you play it in something like Bounce, and you're playing something like a Bounce Mirror, a lot of Bounce decks right now do play Iron Man, and that is a great hit, right? Because you turn an Iron Man into a 5/0. That's an unplayable card. If they're not playing Iron Man, maybe they're only playing America Chavez top end, you are actually extremely likely to hit the Beast. And that's a critical freaking card. Like if you hit the Beast in a Bounce Mirror, game over. So Ham, no nuance, played against everything, played in every deck. Absolutely not. I think that's fundamentally wrong. Ham in the right meta, and actually particularly I think as a tournament card for where you can have an expected meta, I think it's actually very, very powerful.
Ham in Bounce seems to be roughly correct to me. Because it's not like you're hurting for power. We're already sacrificing power for utility a lot of places in that deck. And so I don't really mind it there at all, but it's just like I feel like there is just some like people are just putting it in the deck and being like, yeah, that's good. And I feel like again, it's the Howard the Duck thing. Is like you remember when it's good, right? Like you're like, oh, I hit that and that's why I won, because it shows you the information. You don't remember when Iceman was good, right? Like you don't remember because you might not ever see the card that Iceman hit. You don't know how it changed the game. I know this is going to sound like I think the card is bad. I think the card is quite powerful. I just feel like there's a lot of we're running it for no reason right now.
Yeah, one thing that both you and I think, give less credence to than sort of the average stat player, or at least the average stat player that appears on my Twitter in some sort of random thread, is that they seem to value the information taken from Spider-Ham greatly.
No, that's correct, I think you are supposed to value that information. Like, you're supposed to value the information of what you don't have to play around. Like, it's good against Electro, for example. Because if you see an Odin gone, suddenly you're not worried about, like, Odin Doom. Or you see a Zola gone, you're not worried about Black Panther Zola. Like, it's good for ruling out things you have to play around. That information is important. But I think, again, that's like sort of very matchup dependent, right? Like if you're going to lose to either a Hulk or a Doom, it kind of doesn't matter which one that you got rid of.
I think a lot of players are making this argument from the angle of, hey, I play this card on ladder, not conquest, and I play this card and hit my opponent's Ultron. So now I know they're on Patriot almost instantly, and they value that highly. I think that's actually not as valuable as a lot of people make it out to be. And now, especially in conquest, which I think is, I don't know, I've been playing a lot of it, obviously, in preparation for this. I don't value that information nearly as highly. It's great to know what to not play around, but I'll say it like this. I play Spider Ham for the effect of turning something into a pig, specifically queuing a deck with Spider Ham into an opponent's deck that I know is heavily reliant on some sort of 5 or 6 cost top end, and knowing that I can take that out of their hand pretty quickly.
I've got a question for you, because I think the pitch for Spider Ham and Bounce is, does this swing the lockdown matchup? And I think the answer is still, no, it doesn't. But, it could.
It's not a bad card, right? It can help, but you have to play it early as well. I think most of the time, if you're playing its high Evo lockdown, you need to hit. I don't know. I don't think this changed during the nerf. I would be, maybe I'm confused. Spider Ham is a confusing card, but I think you have to hit Hulk early, right? So you're incentivized to play it on turn 1 because you don't want to snapshot the ongoing ability and be like a 6/16, right?
Yeah. It's sort of an awkward situation with Hulk, specifically the ongoing snapshot. I don't really know if that's intended or what, but it seems fine to me. I don't really know.
Yeah. Well, so when it comes to what is maybe the competing most popular deck in the game, which is high Evo mid-range and high Evo Lockjaw. Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that when you're looking at a deck like Bounce and you're trying to find more of an edge versus those decks, I think the Spider Ham is good. I think you find a lot of your edge in the Shang-Chi, actually. We'll talk about it later, but there was a list that performed very, very well, a high Evo Lockjaw list that actually ran Dr. Doom as a way to counter Bounce specifically, and did it very, very effectively.
High Evo Lockjaw list that you say ran Dr. Doom, isn't that all of them?
Sorry, Doc Ock. Two doctors in the house here. Dr. Octopus, thank you for clarifying. Yes, Dr. Octopus. Anyway, Spider Ham, TLDR. Good card. Maybe not as good as it's going to be touted to be on Twitter, but I think better than I expected it to be. Maybe it's because of the sort of meta that we exist in, but a conditional card at that. A 1/1 that has this effect does not get slotted into every deck whatsoever. It's definitely a specific card at that. All right, well, let's talk about the prep. And Cam, you can actually help me talk about the prep here, because I want to talk about the metagame, the expected metagame, and how to prepare for it. So going into the content creator tournament here, this was last week prior to OTA. You really had to evaluate the meta, I think, by looking at a few decks, and those decks were high Evo, and there's a few variations of that, and the nuance of those variations definitely does matter. So you have high Evo Lockjaw, you have high Evo midrange, and high Evo Lockdown. Most popular probably being Lockjaw, second most popular being midrange, third most popular being that Lockdown version. Other than that, maybe tied for most popular deck, maybe a little bit less popular on ladder, at least, with something like Bounce. But Bounce at the end of the end of the preparation phase, in my opinion, almost categorically the best deck by quite a long margin, because of its matchup spread and because of how just fundamentally powerful it was into everything.
I've been a Kitty Pryde truther for 6 weeks. I've been telling people, I'm so happy to see my girl thrive, because I've been talking about this deck. I've been putting in there I know, okay, we have a bad matchup against high evolutionary Lockdown. I get it, sure, but it beats everything else just by being a better deck.
Yes, and I think you'll like the stream when you watch it back, because I talk about you putting this list out there, and this, especially Pink Print. This has been a list that you've put on Twitter a million times, and it caused me a lot of headache, right? Because it's very hard for me to play a Bounce list with tech in it, so I could have more edge.
Yeah, if you put tech in it, you lose the mirror.
You absolutely get freaking destroyed in the mirror. That's why this 2-deck format was super interesting. But yes, the overall conclusion is Bounce, maybe competing at that time as the second most popular deck or close to the most popular deck, is the best deck. This high Evo nonsense, it's
the high Evo nonsense, it's a different context, right? So the high Evo nonsense, high Evo Lockdown was the best deck by a bunch, right? And when that deck was everywhere, it didn't matter how good Bounce was because it would beat your ass. Bounce does not beat High Evo Lockdown. It does not do it. Like, you can try, but like they're gonna like Storm is basically the scariest card on Earth. They can Professor X a lane, they can Spider-Man a lane, and if you can't play in 2 lanes, your Hitmonkeys suck. And that's fundamentally the bad matchup, right? Yes. And so what arose out of that was, how do we beat that matchup? And that's where the Lockjaw decks came in. Just playing a bunch of big guys. Electro, just playing a bunch of big guys, going big enough that like the bounce decks have that the lockdown decks have absolutely no answer. You remember the original versions of the Lockjaw decks had Dracula in it. Great card to play into Storm. Things like that, right? Just absolutely hammering that matchup. And eventually that matchup got hammered to the point that it's just not common anymore. And when that matchup is just not common anymore, and everyone is relying on literally only Wave to stop Bounce, well, then Bounce is the best deck again, right?
Yeah. Wave stopping Bounce is definitely a meme.
Lie.
I think
it's the biggest goddamn lie. Wave will help.
No.
Wave will help, but you don't get to snap waves, because if you snap the waves, they know you have the wave, and then they deploy on turn 5, and you just die anyway, because you're playing Wave, which is 3 power on turn 5.
Yes, you play a 3 power. You play a 3 power Wave, and I play a 10 power Hitmonkey, and then I have Chavez as top end.
Yep.
Like it's actively not that good. In ladder, I guess it's a bit better, but in Conquest, I mean, you play Bounce for a couple Conquests, you realize pretty quickly, oh hey, I can play around this Wave card, especially after I've seen it.
Sandman.
What's hard
on the other hand?
Turn 4 Sandman, turn 4 Sandman, turn 5 Spider-Man, turn 3 Storm. F that. That is what like really those are the things
that beat your ass, right? Like Bounce will still lose to Storm Spider-Man. It will, and this is actually the biggest appeal for Hitmonkey here for me, or not Hitmonkey, for Spider Pig, is that if you play it early enough, you can like randomly hit a Spider-Man.
Yes,
it's such a big deal. If you can hit a Spider-Man with a pig or an Iceman, oh my god, you're doing so much better than you previously were.
Yeah. All right. Well, the sort of tier 2 decks still quite popular decks on their own, but just they weren't these premier S tier decks like Lockjaw and like Bounce. Patriot, which is sort of been falling out of favor a bit, and then Electro.
Patriot didn't go tall enough to beat the Lockjaw decks. So Patriot would just be like in this situation where it's like, okay, well, I guess we have to play Shang-Chi if we want to win that matchup. So that kind of sucks. And Electro, I actually worked with Moyan a little bit on this one. Mm-hmm. It's good into those 3 decks. Lockjaw, Lockdown, and Bounce. It's like good into those decks. It's like the only deck that I know of that can actually just play good games into all of them, right? But
I think
it just sort of randomly loses to stuff. It just kind of dies to like stuff sometimes.
Yeah, there was so I brought Bounce as my main deck this tournament, and there was 2 decks. There was actually just 2 decks I was afraid of, represented by 4 players in the 8-Dream Player tournament, and that was Ramp, specifically Moyan's Ramp list, and Lambie's Lockdown High Evo list.
Yeah.
Outside of that, I felt like I had completely favorable matchups. One thing on Patriot as well, I think why Patriot kind of fell out of favor, is Patriot still had any sort of downside that it had before, but it also could get out points land by Bounce sometimes, which is like, why not just play Bounce?
Patriot had to cover so many different things, right? You have to play the Shang to beat the Lockjaw decks, right? You have to play the Wave to beat the Bounce decks. And it's like, okay, if you have to do all this, can't you just find another deck that does that stuff?
Exactly, right? It feels like it's sort of occupying the Bounce archetype, but it's a bit weaker, sort of all around. It's like if you're bringing, let's quickly. I want to rewind a little bit. The tournament, by the way, for the format, it was 5 rounds of Swiss cut to top 8, but most importantly, it was a 2-deck format. So you would get paired into an opponent. You would bring 2 decks, no cards could overlap, and you would pick whatever deck you want. Your opponent would not know. So there's a bit of metagaming and mind gaming that goes there, right? Do you bring the 2 best decks? Do you bring the best deck plus a deck that forces your opponent to play a favorable matchup into your ideal deck, right? So if I brought Bounce and I don't want people to play Pink Print into it, I bring a counter to Pink Print, right? So my opponent can't reasonably choose Pink Print into me. They have to choose their other deck, and I force it into my Bounce deck, which I believe is the best deck in the format. That was sort of the tournament, and it's really, really important to keep in mind because that shaped pretty much everybody's strategy and was critical to actually doing well. And most people did end up bringing the deck that they wanted to play, and then the other deck that just kind of forced their opponent to not play other decks they didn't want to play against into them. So it was really, really interesting.
What do you think of the idea that the metagame is like extremely polarized in a way that is not ideal for the first month of Conquest? Where it's just like, oh, I picked a deck, but my final boss is the deck I could never beat in a million years. Like, I've been feeling that a lot.
So do you feel that for this, the format of this tournament, or for Conquest?
For Conquest. Because like when you look at the format of this tournament, when you describe the things that people are doing, they're all just like, well, I can't play against my bad matchup, so my second deck is devoted entirely to beating my bad matchup. And I'm saying that dynamic applies onto Conquest, where you don't get a second deck, and you're just going to run into that bad matchup or not, and that's going to be it.
Definitely. But I could see that. I could see how that works. I definitely empathize with the argument. That being said, I do think that it's maybe a bit worse on ladder. Ladder, of course, you just get into your next match really quickly, but ladder's more zero sum.
Yeah.
Where the other deck just totally wins. Where in Conquest, I mean, maybe your deck literally just doesn't have the tools. But if you bring a deck that does have a bit of tools in it, right? Like maybe your opponent has Wave, which could smoke you on ladder, but it doesn't really in Conquest. Maybe you have the Shang-Chi.
No, I just mean like you're playing Bounce and UQ into Sandman. It's just like, oh, I'm dead.
Well, the thing about Conquest is I think
you're playing Sera and UQ into Bounce. And it's just like, oh, well, they don't have, as long as they throw priority, I can never win this.
Yeah, the thing about Conquest is I feel like you have to play it less of I mean, this is kind of Marvel Snap fundamentally, but Conquest is less of a card game, more of a betting game. And that's really where sort of this skill of how to snap, when to leave, and when to retreat, and when to stay in it becomes really important, because you're right, turn 4 Sandman, you really can't beat it as Bounce. But the whole idea is to sort of manipulate the game state and the set of games in order for you to be able to stay when your opponent doesn't have those cards. And you have to be able to juice cubes during those matchups. Obviously, a lot of that is draw dependent, but on top of that, it's very location dependent. And knowing what locations favor you in whatever amounts are unfavorable to you is just very important for snapping early, staying in, knowing when to retreat. Like when we were playing the content creator tournament, I mean, there was times when I would leave almost four matches in a row. And it feels terrible. And it doesn't work well at all for our human lizard brains. Because now you're like, okay, opportunity cost, I have to stay in, I have to juice some cubes. But really, that's not the case, because you don't start the high stakes till round 5, and you really need this like buffer of cubes. Your last few cubes are much more valuable than your first few, because you need this sort of snap equity and to be able to threaten your opponent for like a X number of cubes later in the game. Because if you could put down to like 3 or 2 and your opponent's on 7, they could pretty much just auto snap you off the bat and put you on sort of an all-in consistently, and that's just a terrible spot to be in. It's actually almost unwinnable. But yeah, to answer your original question,
I've lost from those spots before. Okay.
No, I mean, Lambie beat Den from there. I mean, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, I beat a bot in my silver game that way after I got 8 cubes.
I lost. I did the right thing. I got an 8 cube juicer against a Sandman deck, and then lost 5 games in a row where I didn't get to play more than one card past turn 4 on any one of those games. Like, it was just like either Electro into Sandman or Wave into Sandman. I was just dead every time. It's like, okay, well, I guess I just lose 5.
To answer your original question about the polarization of Conquest, I think it's a thing, but I know I personally haven't been affected by it too much, just queuing Conquest. But at the same time, I don't find it to be as extreme as in other games, where I feel like with Hearthstone, it's kind of a core component of ladder gameplay, right? Is these polarizing matchups where you just kind of lose. I don't nearly feel that as much as in Snap. One thing I do want to say, and I don't mean it in the wrong way, but Conquest is really interesting going from ladder to Conquest, because the matches have been really easy. I guess because of the normalization of MMR and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's no MMR in it.
Yeah. Me and Lambie were talking about this, about how you actually couldn't really use Conquest as a means to prepare for the tournament because of the lack of MMR. And that's just been it. I don't know. It's very much been a main motif of my experience. Has been these Conquest matches have been a bit easier, to be honest. Like, of course, I was playing good decks because I was trying to get reps for the tournament. But yeah, I'm not sure. It overshadows digging deep into things of like, okay, does this actually feel good at the highest level when both players are of equal skill, and there's these polarizing matchups because there's things like turn 4 Sandman, and you've decided to cube Bounce, and they have to sit through 20 cubes worth of games, right? So I'm not totally sure, but I haven't noticed it too much.
It's just an interesting thing because you're talking about the dynamic of the tournament being about like, you want to avoid the polarizing matchups and get in your good ones. And it's like that's a really interesting, like, cause I think that's going to be true always. But I do feel like these are very polarizing matchups, like bounce into Sandman, bounce into Lockdown, or any other deck into bounce, basically. Any other deck trying to do like Sera stuff or Darkhawk stuff into bounce is just like, oh, well, it's you, but better, right? Like that's the thing that I think, like, if you ask me to name a patient zero of this metagame, it's Kitty Pryde. Like, she's definitely what everything rotates around. She's the baseline. She sets the bar. And that's kind of always how I felt, because even when people were playing just like every deck that beat her ever, she was still fine.
Yeah, and I'm happy you pointed that out because, reflecting on this tournament, if it had been a one deck tournament, you bring one deck to this tournament and you queue into your opponent and there's nothing past that, I think it would have felt like shit, to be honest.
It would have been terrible, right?
So having two decks actually really equalize this sort of paradigm, because you're right. At the highest level, or at playing competitively, if we just brought a single deck, like, you would run into situations where you literally just couldn't win. Your opponent was turn 4 Sandmanning you, locking you out of lanes, stuff like that. For an entire conquest, there's really nothing you can do about that. And they sort of incur the opportunity cost of running into decks that beat them because they're playing some sort of greedy deck that counters bounce. The 2-deck format, though, covers pretty much all those bases. I think that there's multiple ways to approach it in terms of the decks you bring, but it does help mitigate these auto loss matchups. They pretty much don't happen unless you made an incorrect decision with the 2 decks you brought. Do you want to, Cam? You want to dig into the decks that I decided to bring to the tournament and why?
I mean, I think I get why you brought what you brought, actually. You did exactly what Lambie and Browde did, which is say, all right, we're going to play bounce, and then we're going to bring a deck that makes sure no one cues bounce into us.
Exactly.
That's what that is. So, I think their deck is a little more effective at doing it, for what it's worth.
It is. Absolutely. I think that their deck, if I ran it back, I would play their deck, for sure. I think that for the use case in which I was trying to use my deck, it served it well.
Wait, did I say broad? It's Browde.
You said Browde. By the way, he's like 7 feet tall.
Yeah, he's like 8 feet tall. He's like a human giant. He's like 27 feet tall and 8,000 pounds. I don't know. He's actually the size of like one of the bosses from Tears of the Kingdom. He's the size of a Hinox. People may not know this.
Yeah, huge. Anyway, for the audio listeners and for the video, people watching on YouTube, I know we don't have video this week because we're recording remotely from across the world. I will put a link in the description with a Google spreadsheet that has images of all the decks. So please reference that because I won't be popping on.
You're still planning on putting the YouTube video up?
Yeah, we'll still put the YouTube video up.
Just put like audio only in front of it.
Exactly, because there's a lot of people that just use YouTube to listen. But anyway, going over to my decks for the audio listeners, my first deck, which was Bounce, is Kitty Pryde, Bass, Spider-Ham, Iceman, Angela, Hitmonkey, Mysterio, Bishop, Beast, Shang-Chi, Iron Man, America Chavez. We'll talk about the second deck later. Let's talk about this Bounce deck. So in the 2-deck format, I felt like the most polarizing card is America Chavez. I think almost every deck played it, and the biggest trade-off you had to sort of consider when building these decks is which deck gets the America Chavez, right? Because I think both decks want to play it. Both decks, you sort of want to have this top end in case there's a wave on turn 5. You also want to draw your power cards a little bit faster. It just tends to be that most of the decks in the format actually play this card. The high level Lockjaws decks is quite important, etc. I decided to put it in my bounce list so I can draw Kitty Pryde earlier and I can point slam on turn 5. And when I get waived, I can ultimately America Chavez on top of that. Outside of that, the most important card to talk about is the Shang-Chi, which is definitely the sort of 12th or 11th card here, is sort of interchangeable with something like a Jeff. A lot of people play Jeff in this slot. The Shang-Chi is a dead card in a lot of matchups, but it gives you a lot of equity in the sort of high Evo Lockjaw kind of stuff, or anything with high top end, mostly high Evo Lockjaw though. It gives you a lot of edge in that matchup specifically. I think in retrospect, playing this card, I'd probably play it again, and my thesis behind it is that Bounce is so good that I'm willing to have a dead card in the form, or a relatively dead card, because it does make your opponent play inefficiently. Sometimes not buff the Angela super high, or not buff the Bishop super high. Sometimes you'd have to consider Bishop going to 9 or Angela going to 9. I would play a card like this, which is a dead card in some matchups. Things like Patriot, other bounce decks, etc. Because I think that the list is so freaking good. I just think it's the best list, and I want this tech card for when I do get high rolled by a Lockjaw or something like that. Outside of that, another important card to talk about is Iron Man. Not all bounce lists play this card.
I feel like you have to choose between Iron Man and Shang, and you just picked both.
Yeah, I just picked both, which I think was totally fine. Like I was very comfortable having the Shang and the Iron Man over like an Iron Man and a Jeff. To be honest, I think that bounce actually. I think it's really important for bounce to play Iron Man. I actually think this card is like not very cuttable. I think you need to have the threat of sort of like the single lane pressure that Iron Man can have, and then have your split lane pressure with something like the Hit Monkey that comes down in the counter lane. Iron Man, especially with something like Bass, like these are some of your most snappable hands. Honestly, why this deck is so good is because I believe your snap equity with a deck like Bounce is very, very powerful. You can snap early. It's very easy to perceive some of your best hands, and it tends to sort of play out in your favor. One thing I'll say is that when you snap before the second and third locations flip, there's a lot of locations that don't favor Bounce.
You do get screwed over by locations a lot, and you also, I think this deck benefits heavily from open lists, just knowing what they do and do not have to play around, right? We talked about how, like, Wave isn't good against Bounce in Conquest, and that's because once you see the wave, you're never losing to it again. And that, like, knowing that before you even start, knowing exactly what you have to play around is a huge deal, because the baseline strategy of Bounce is stronger than everything it's going against. So as long as you operate it correctly, you should be good to go.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't think there was a single Bounce player in this tournament that walked away from a match and be like, damn, I got waved. You would absolutely expect wave to be coming down third 5 and you're point slamming sort of accordingly. Let's talk about deck 2, because this is where I definitely took a different approach than the rest of the meta. I think archetypically and sort of ideologically, I took the same approach that, like you said, like Lambie and Browday did, and that's that I brought a deck that heavily counters Bounce. That I believe is either 90 to 95+% into Bounce. Like Bounce almost can't win. And the reason I brought this deck is because another version of Bounce, something you've probably seen if you pay attention to Cam's Twitter, is called named Pink Print. That absolutely destroys my Bounce deck. It plays things like Falcon, it plays more 1-drops, and it just point slams way harder, and there's nothing you can do about that. It is just better in the mirror. So I realized that pretty quickly. I was like, okay, I just need a second deck that my opponent will look at my deck list and say, if I Q Bounce into him, it's suicide, right? Because if I see my opponent has Pink Print, it's almost objectively correct for me to Q my Sera deck into them, regardless of what else they're playing. But as a result, they should never Q Bounce into me. So it's an interesting paradigm, but that's the function of the list, is just don't Q Bounce into my deck. You have to play your second deck. You cannot play Bounce into me, because if there's any chance that I pick Sera into you, you ought to lose. And to sort of emphasize this point, not to rub it in, not as an egotistical thing.
So
but
you're talking about the Lambie thing, right? Like this actually I think illustrates that it was a bad choice. Weirdly, I'll get to that in a second.
Okay, so basically, Lambie has the same ideology as bringing a Bounce list and bringing a counter Bounce list. I have Sera. I have the Sera deck in my lineup. I go up against Lambie in round 3. I think it was round 3. He Qs Bounce into me. I Q Sera. It ends up 10-0. And for me, with the decks that I brought and the reasons I brought them and why I built the Sera list is because I thought that pretty much that exact scenario was repeatable almost every time the Sera deck queued into that Bounce deck. But yeah, regardless of that,
right? But like that's the thing. That's the thing, right? Like the whole point is to scare people off bringing Bounce, right? And it doesn't do that if they don't know that you beat Bounce.
So that's the problem, right? Is if you look at Lambie's list, you look at high Evo, lane lockdown. Everybody knows that beats Bounce because it's been beating Bounce on ladder forever. I actually had this conversation with my testing partner, Sasha, a lot for the tournament. I was like, what if people don't know this loses to Bounce? And it's Q Bounce anyway. Because the idea actually, Cam, is if you're playing a Bounce list, like my Bounce list, right? Not Pink Print, but you're playing a tech Bounce list with Iron Man, This deck is just a proxy. I'm not actually queuing it into you because I know you won't queue it.
It's not real.
And I queue my bounce deck.
But they have to know that in order for it to not be real.
So I talked to Lambie after the series. And I'm like, Lambie, why did you keep bouncing to me? You can't do that. Like, you can't do that. He's like, honestly, I just didn't know. He's like, I just didn't know that was how this matchup went. And he's like, I know now, but I just didn't know. And you're right. That was a downside of it. But let's talk about the list just so people get a baseline here.
I want to talk about this list a lot because, like, anything with an infinitely good bounce matchup can't be that bad.
It actually is a pretty good Evo matchup too, and we'll talk about that.
So you're saying so the list is and then just didn't play it.
Yeah. Well, it loses. I mean, it doesn't have a great Evo map. It's better than you would expect. Anyway, the list. Jeff, Silk, Brood, Silver Surfer, Storm, Juggernaut, Killmonger, Shadow King, Wave, Maximus, Iron Lad, Sera. Changes I would make sort of post-tournament. I might change the Silk to a Goose. Just for
I was wondering why you were on Silk in the world where you're playing Iron Lad. That seems god-awful.
It's fine. It's fine, to be honest. Like, I just would. My testing partner played Goose here mainly because he didn't have Silk. But
I honestly looked at his deck and I was like, "Oh, that's better."
Yeah, it probably is better. The Silk is it's cute. It's cute for sure. But a key card that a lot of people didn't have on their radar part of this tournament that I think probably should have. A few other lists brought it, and that's Shadow King. Shadow King is very, very good against bounce. It's also good against Evo mid-range. So when things like Cyclops is, let's say you play Brood in a lane, they play Cyclops in a lane, their Cyclops is dinging your Broods. You play Shadow King on there, ultimately it'll put those Broods back up to the same power, which can be
that's actually really slick. I mean, is this finally time for Shadow King? Have we finally hit a metagame with so many changes in base power that Shadow King is good?
Yep. It's a pretty good card, right? Resets the Wasp stuff. In bounce, it's devastating, right? Bounce, you effectively delete Angela.
Right, you delete Hitmonkey, Bishop. You delete Angela, you delete Bishop, do you delete Kitty?
Kitty Pryde.
Jesus. Yep. But you need to not have priority for that to happen.
Exactly. So you don't necessarily need to have not have priority. You need to not have priority to blow them out, like, out of the universe, right? So, like, to get the Kitty.
If you don't have priority, you can still kill an Angela and a Bishop, right? If you do have priority.
Exactly. Yeah. So people almost never stack them in the same lane. And that's pretty much correct when you're playing bounce. It's more correct when you're playing against Shadow King. That being said, just hitting one is pretty much enough. And the Surfer list on its own, it puts a lot of points on the board. There's also Storm. So Storm Juggernaut, not great for bounce. Bounce is not like seeing Storm Juggernaut. Very hard to deal with, lock down a lane. And in a normal game of Snap, you have 3 locations flipped. It's pretty common that one location is not going to be fantastic for bounce. So you Storm the other location, you Juggernaut it. It's just not great for them. You can also, you have Jeff, you have Silk to get more points in that lane if you need. And then outside of that, you have the turn 5 Wave, which is actually more of a threat than something that gets played a lot. I might have actually cut that card in retrospect.
I was about to ask, do you actually play that? Because the Wave doesn't make a ton of sense here. Like, it's like you're either playing it on 4, but, like, if you're playing it on 5, the bounce deck's actually better at being a deployed on 5 deck than you are.
So the reason why I played Wave is I actually was not playing this list into regular bounce. So against, like, Lambie, for instance, I would usually queue my bounce deck, but the reason I didn't queue my bounce deck is my bounce deck auto loses into a second deck, so I have to play my Sera deck. But against, like, a bounce mirror with my bounce list versus another list that's very similar, I queue bounce because I know my opponent's not going to queue bounce, or at least they shouldn't, right? The issue comes. Sorry, it's kind of. The issue comes when they play Pink Print. So if my opponent has Pink Print in their lineup, I have to queue Sera, and that Pink Print is more subject to Wave than the regular bounce list. It doesn't run America Chavez. It runs things like Falcon. It's sending things back to hand much more often. It's just a bit weaker to Wave, and especially not having the Chavez.
For the record, my Pink Print list actually does run America Chavez. Always has. I am a big America Chavez believer. D-Money just cut it.
Yep. D-Money did cut it. D-Money was actually, I think, the only player in the entire tournament that didn't have Chavez in any of his lists, which we'll get into. But yeah, the Wave I might have cut. Killmonger also pretty good against bounce, but not as good as you would think. You probably look at bounce and you're like, wow, Killmonger smokes this deck. Not really. You have to not have priority on turn 6 pretty much for Killmonger to do a lot. It can still do a little, for sure. Silver Surfer, buffing up a Brood lane or buffing up a lane you've stormed, you're playing the Iron Lad, and there's a bit of a non-bow with Iron Lad, Maximus, and the whole idea is that...
Can you ever beat Lockjaw with this deck?
Yeah, so you can. It's not favorable, but there's a few times where I theoretically would have had to queue this deck into Lockjaw if someone's running Pink Print as their other deck. It's just not favored. I think the thing is like it's actually winnable, where that is so far beyond the ideal scenario for me is that this second backup deck that only exists as a proxy deck actually has some game.
What does a winnable game with this deck into Lockjaw look like?
A winnable game with into Lockjaw, you are likely locking down a lane with something like Storm. You're closing it off with something else. You're, let's say, getting close to auto-winning that lane. You've filled it up with stuff, and then you move to win the other lane with something like an Iron Lad, and then on turn 6, you juggernaut them out of it. Yes, they have Dr. Doom, but Dr. Doom often won't beat the power that exists on your side lanes. So a bit of a El Dorado situation, but winnable, to say the least.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so not great, but winnable. And for the purpose of this deck, that's amazing. This deck is never supposed to play Lockjaw. So if by some crazy means your opponent ignores everything that's in front of them and ends up queuing Lockjaw into a matchup where you're queuing Sera, which I have all the players written out, KM 1 through 18. I have all of their decks written out, all of their names, and I have what I'm queuing into them. So out of 18 players, there's 4 matchups where I queue Sera. 4 matchups. Outside of that, never. So it pretty much never happens outside of that. Anyway, let's talk a bit about the tournament. We'll just go through some matches. So my first round, I played Wilwell. Wilwell played Patriot. I do believe I played Sera against him, or I might have played Bounce. Anyway, I played Bounce. So I'm just looking at my thing. My notes back. I played Bounce into him. It was a very close matchup. So round 1, I ended up on a 1QV1 cube, and ended up taking it from Willow there. But super, super close. Second matchup, I played Hitmeister. Willow was on Patriot, by the way. I played Hitmeister. Yep. Hitmeister, who was on Haiva Lockjaw. It was relatively close, but there was a match where we had the Rickety Bridge flip first location, second location, literally doesn't matter. Third location, Mojo World. He plays the Lockjaw into Mojo World, hits a Chavez off the first roll. I know that I can basically pass my turn and I will win the game because I'm playing Bounce and I have Shang-Chi.
Right, you have a Shang, so you're always going to win the Mojo World whenever there's a 9 power thing there.
Exactly. So I think the Hitmeister made a little bit of a mistake there and actually stayed in for, I think it was definitely at least 4 cubes. It might have been a little bit more. So stayed in deep on that game when it was basically, I mean, it literally was guaranteed for me as long as I had the Shang because we 100% tie Rickety Bridge and then you always win Mojo World because you're plus 100 then after you Shang something. After that, I played Lambie. So Lambie queued, like we talked about, Lambie queued his Bounce deck into my Sera deck, which was pretty favorable for me. And then after that, I played Den. Den went 5-0 in Swiss, and I played into Den's high Evo Lockjaw list, but was playing Dr. Doom. So Dr. Doom is pretty good against Bounce. You can play around it, and if you go back and you watch Lambie's matches against Den, we'll see him do that quite well. You can play around it by having Kitty in hand, sort of predicting where the Doc Hawk is going to go, and playing the Kitty and ultimately opening up the lane by 1 spot. Lambie also did have Jeff, which only furthers your ability to be able to do that exact thing. So
I am a big fan of the Jeff. I really like the Jeff.
Yes.
It's good.
Yeah, I agree with you. So I lost to Den, had some really tough Doc Ox, but I ended up, so I was 3-1 at that point. And then the last round, I played D-Money. I actually played in the first round of top 8. And D-Money queued Patriot into me. So D-Money queues Patriot into me, even though he has pink print. I'm forced to play Sera by looking at his lineup, and I'm like, okay, I can't queue regular Bounce because he has pink print effectively. So I queue Sera into his Patriot deck, and I win. Top 8 is the next day. It's a 2-day event. And now I'm faced with a pretty interesting scenario. I beat D-Money on Sera against Patriot, but I know that matchup sucks for Sera. I got pretty lucky. I drew Storm a lot, locked down lanes, and he just wasn't able to basically was locked out of a lane most of the times and wasn't able to win the other ones. So I know the matchup is bad for me. So in the morning, before the tournament, we were waiting to get let in. I walked up to D-Money and I was talking. I was like, oh, you have a really interesting choice, because he played Patriot into me and lost. So I think incorrect way to go about it, but the human way to go about it is like, maybe you just queue your other deck, right? And Pink Print is pretty powerful to me, but it auto loses into my Sera deck. So you could think, you know what, I lost with this deck. I don't know that Pink Print loses into Sera, so I'm just going to play my Pink Print deck. Maybe I'll have a better result. And D-Money in the morning was like, oh, I'm just going to play the same deck. And then about like 30 minutes or 45 minutes before the match, we had a lot of time. We were setting up for stream. He's coming over. He's like, yeah, I might play Bounce. I don't know what I'm going to play. I'm pretty confident. All this stuff. I was like, oh, this guy's playing Sera again, or playing Patriot again for sure. So I queued my Bounce. I was like, because he was trying to mess with me. So I was like, he's 100% queuing his freaking Patriot again. So I queued my Bounce deck, which has a much better matchup into his Patriot deck. One thing to say is his Patriot deck does have Super Scroll, which is good. It's good against me. Prevents me from doing things like turn 5 Iron Man. But what it lets me do, or way I can play around.
Leave you on 2 dead cards? That leaves you as like, Shang-Chi dead and Iron Man dead.
So I would argue that Iron Man is not dead. Iron Man you just play on turn 6, Iron Man plus Giddy. And for D-Money to play Super Scroll on turn 6, it's very, very heads up. Like, that's a very heads up play and can go wrong most of the time, I think. So Iron Man is not dead. It becomes a much less efficient card at that. It's not ideal that the opponent has Super Scroll in their deck, but you can somewhat play around it. Anyway, it was a tough match. I think I played pretty poorly, and I lost a critical match in the first round of high stakes, and it put me in sort of a brutal position to try to take the series back. So I lost that match, and I was knocked out. D-Money ended up going to the finals against Lamby series, actually. And I think that D-Money's lists, by the way, are probably one of the most interesting set of like 2 decks, because you see people bring Bounce and then they bring this like counter to Bounce with a super control deck, basically. D-Money brings Pink Print, which is the most aggressive Bounce deck, and Patriot, which is like, it's also a very aggressive points land deck.
You just like, look, you have to pick one of these. Answer this. Yeah. Answer this. Answer my questions.
D-Money's Patriot list is pretty hard to play against, even in open deck lists, because the Invisible Woman is definitely the 12th card. Don't get me wrong. And it's not very good. But what the Invisible Woman does, or at least just what having the top end that D-Money does, having Iron Man, Blue Marvel, Doctor Doom, Onslaught does, is it's kind of hard to predict if he's going tall in a lane or if he's going wide. Like, it is. Like, it could be Patriot plus Brood on turn 6. It could be Doctor Doom on turn 6. It could be freaking Onslaught. It's a lot to deal with, to be honest. And it's hard, especially when something's locked behind a freaking Invisible Woman, to be like, okay, am I pushing the side lanes, or am I pushing the Invisible Woman lane? Okay, maybe I have the left lane one. It's just, there's a lot of different ways for his Patriot list to sort of navigate turns 5 through 6, and ultimately I think it's one of the harder lists I had to play against, which is funny because Patriot gets criticized as being an easy deck to play. It's a very hard deck to play against, very, very hard. But ultimately D-Money took that match. Cam, I'll throw it back over to you now that you've had a chance to look at the list. You've heard a little bit about the tournament. Is there anything, any list you want to talk about specifically, or just sort of like any like macro stuff in regards to archetypes you want to hit on here?
No, I mean, I think this... I hate to be this guy. This tournament result confirmed my priors. Prior number 1, Lamby series really good at Marvel Snap. Prior number 2 is that the triangle, it's the same shit. It's the same shit, right? Like, you have the Bounce deck. The Bounce deck loses to the Evo Lockdown deck. The Evo Lockdown deck loses to the Evo Lockjaw deck. And then you can make a bunch of other decks that have good matchups against 2 of those decks, but not against the third one. And that's the meta.
If you were to play this tournament, which decks would you bring, and what would be your philosophy? Would it be the same one that Lamby has and that I brought, which is you bring Bounce and then you bring the ultimate counter Bounce deck?
I would have brought what Moyen did, but probably a different second deck.
Okay.
Because I honestly think Electro is really fucking good into every one of those good decks. Right? But you need a second deck that beats bad shit, right? So I would have probably gone with something like Electro and then Bounce. Mm-hmm. And the idea there, especially since we were able, if we don't run American Chavez in the Electro deck, we can run it in our Bounce deck, right? So you take Moyen's Electro deck, and then you go like that, and Bounce, probably, looking back in retrospect, would have been a match, like a thing I would have felt very comfortable with, because you put yourself in a situation where absolutely nobody can Q Bounce into you, and both of your decks are, like, if you end up in the lockdown matchup, there's very few matchups that make me afraid to Q Electro, right? The things that beat Electro are like Dino decks with Cosmo, because they can make leader asymmetrical, and because they can like Cosmo your Arnim Zola Panther stuff, right? But most other stuff is genuinely not that scary with this deck. You are genuinely just pretty good into a lot of other stuff that you'd run into. And that's probably what I would do.
If you brought Bounce, what sort of list would you bring? Would you bring more of a pink print list, or would you bring something closer to the list?
I probably would have messed up, but I would like, looking at it right now, I'd bring. Okay, so let me actually think about this. Right? So if we think no one's ever going to play Bounce against us, there's no good real reason for us to have pink print, right? We want to have probably Lambie's list. Because that one gives us like the most game against the most stuff. If you accept that Iron Man is just good enough in terms of just being better Shang, right, in the lockjaw matchup, then you're just fine with it.
Yeah. So let's just going from this tournament, looking at the future. I mean, obviously it's freaking Marvel Snap, so we have cards coming out every week. We have OTAs and stuff like that. I think big takeaways from this tournament is, I mean, high Evo. At least the perception of high Evo and high Evo lockjaw, I think, might be knocked down a little bit of a peg. And although a lot of you listening to this probably believe this before this tournament, I think post this tournament, it's pretty clear Bounce is the best deck. I mean, you've been saying it, Cam. I know a lot of people have, but Bounce is just, it's like the freaking deck in this game.
It's not necessarily the best. Like it's all about context, right? Bounce was only bad when the best deck, which was previously Evo Lockdown by, like, let's be honest, like before this, Evo Lockdown was the best deck in the game. We have this straight from Second Dinner. It was the best deck in the game by like every single metric. Like, that's why they nerfed Spider-Man. It was the best deck in the game. It's the best thing you could possibly be doing. And it also just happened to like 80-20 bounce. So it was like it's the best deck in the game, and like 30% of people you play were playing it, and at 80-20 to bounce. And Bounce was still like a solid deck in that context. So now in a context where everyone has gone away from that deck, and for the record, I am pretty sure it's still 80-20's Bounce. It's really hard to beat that rough, shit. Yeah. But like it is just a really tough thing to deal with. But yeah, I would have brought like, I consider like an Electro plus Bounce lineup to be like really similar to D-Money's lineup, where it's just like, look, choose something here. Choose one of these incredibly annoying things that you have to play against now. Pick one. In like, I suspect most people are going to be picking based on, I think they're going to like be like, oh, I don't want to deal with Electro, right? So they're not going to Q Bounce into me. So you just play Bounce into favorables all day.
So sort of looking forward, what do you like? One thing, I think people need to take another look at Shadow King, to be honest. Like even in regular Conquest, like obviously in a hyper whatever, a meta in a tournament, right? Which is very concentrated, so hyper concentrated meta that you can accurately predict. You can go look at people's Twitters, you can look at their streams, you can see what they have an affinity for. They're talking about it. You're right. Like, I mean, Shadow King is like this card that has basically gotten zero play. It comes in, it's quite good against Bounce, and actually has some game against Evo, right? It has, let's just say it doesn't have game. It has a use case, which is surprising.
But like the issue, like I would be in on that deck, right? That deck looks great, but here's my question: what if you just played Shadow King in a normal Sera deck? Because right now the issue I have with normal Sera is your Bounce matchup is fucking terrible. Like your Bounce matchup is just like, they're just you but better. Your Bounce matchup is just the worst possible shit. So like, are you able to play Storm and Shadow King? Like, how do you make that matchup not bad? Because like, I'm actually pretty comfortable playing Sera into every other matchup, basically. Like, I'm cool with that. But like, then you Q Bounce and you're just like, oh, they do like 30 points in a lane and you do like 20.
So Sera, a deck that probably, or at least traditional Sera, probably a deck that gets priority and maintains it, especially with Kitty Pryde going back to hand.
Yep.
And that's how you get the big blowout. So you're not going to get the big blowout of Shadow King. I do think that Shadow King taking an Angela from 7 or 9-0 is enough to swing that matchup. I mean, that is a huge freaking card, right? You know, Shadow King coming down and being a 3-9 or a 3-12, which happens so often versus bounce, amazing. And then if you happen, by some miracle, to not have priority, it's like a 3-20, bro. It's ridiculous.
So you're
like,
saying I should try it in normal Sera?
Yes,
like,
I think so.
I'm way more confident in normal Sera into basically every other matchup than I am into in the Sera Surfer.
So the question is, I think the question, if you want to test Shadow King, do you take Shadow King, do you take it to a conquest? Like, do you queue up a conquest? Or do you go queue up ladder? I don't know. I think you should try it. But if you're like, hey, friend, hey, stream, who wants to play bounce into my Sera deck? I'm bringing Shadow King. You should probably destroy them. Like,
you really think
it's a really good card.
You think it would be that, like, you think just Shadow King would be enough to make the power differential between Sera and this swing?
So that's the answer to a question I didn't have time to figure out when I was testing this, because I don't want to play the Sera deck that has the Storm and the Juggernaut. Like, it has all this other
like, we're playing a bunch of bad shit. What if we just put it in a deck with good shit?
Yes. What if we just play Shadow King?
Yeah. What if
we just make Shadow King a 3-9? Like, that's our floor. Or let's say our floor is like a 3-6 to a 3-9 to a 3-12. Not a 3-20. We don't have to hit the nuts every time. We don't have to guess where the kitty goes and not have priority and all this other BS. Like, Shadow King as a 3-9, nuking Angela, is that good enough? Maybe. I don't know.
I mean, that's where I would start looking, I think, because, like, I'm looking for something that can actually break that paradigm. And right now, Sera is one of those decks that has a good matchup or a plausible matchup into a couple of good decks, and then absolutely loses to bounce. And it's just like, oh.
So okay. You know what sucks about Sera is the stuff that wrecks bounce, like the lockdown list. They also wreck Sera. Like, turn 5 wave against you can be really bad.
Yeah,
like,
you know what I'm interested in? I'm less interested in Sera, and I'm more interested in Zabu Darkhawk, Black Bolt stuff, which I've always sort of considered just be Sera but better. Same concept, just better stuff. And it's like, is there a version of that can put Shadow King in there? Is there a version of, like, because those decks are so close in so many spots against so many decks. Like, those decks, it feels like you can always be in range of the best decks, and then they just never get over the hump.
You know, okay, I actually think so. So there's one Zabu Darkhawk Black Bolt deck.
My bad.
Yeah, I didn't hear it actually, but there's one of those decks in the entire tournament, by the way, and that's from Howling Mines, Scott Mines, and that is Kitty Pryde, Korg, Zabu, Jeff, Polaris, Darkhawk, Shang-Chi, Enchantress, Spider-Man, Rockslide, Stature, Black Bolt. Cam, I don't know about you, but that sounds like an easy Enchantress or Shang-Chi cut to throw in a Shadow King. You're telling me Shadow?
You cut Enchantress, you play Shadow King, and then you just, like, the issue then is like, do we have Killmonger in there? Because you want Killmonger in there for the lockdown decks. You want Shadow King in there for the bounce decks. You want Shang-Chi in there for the lockjaw decks. And so, like, I think those are all sort of non-negotiable. But if you can get a deck that has all three of them in there and they work as well as you want them to, I'm a little interested.
Yeah, I think that Shadow King, even Shadow King into Evo, right? Shadow King into Evo, let's say that they only have the Wasps. It's going to pretty often, it'll be a 3-5. That's good. That's a good floor. And you're telling me if they have Cyclops, it's a freaking 3-7 or a 3-9 again? Like, it's nuts. The card actually has use case in this meta, which I think a lot of people didn't look at that card. And any bounce player that has played against a Shadow King will tell you, like, holy shit, that card is terrible to play against. It feels similar to getting locked out of a lane. You're like, wow. Especially if you don't have priority. If you don't have priority,
you die. But, like, any half decent bounce player is going to be. The issue is, like, here's the thing. What I'm wondering if Shadow King can do is pin you between Wave and Shadow King. Like, if you're playing a Darkhawk deck with Wave in it, and, like, you're snapping, are they forced to deploy on 5 and then just die to Shadow King? That's what I'm wondering about. Like, if you're able to do, like, every Darkhawk deck I build has, like, 12 deck slot syndrome, where, like, I can't get all the cards I want in there at the same time. But, like, it just feels like there has to be a way to do it. Like, there has to be something.
So my Sera deck had Wave and Shadow King, and even if Wave wasn't played very often, the fact that there's a point slam on turn 5 and get priority and play the Hit Monkey, you know where the Hit Monkey is, they have priority, etc. Money.
Yes, like it's the threat of the wave that forces them to do stuff. It's an interesting dynamic. All right, I know that you wanted this to only be 45 minutes. It ended up being significantly longer than 45 minutes. So I'm gonna go back to Radio Voice KM here.
And thank you all for listening to the Snapshot podcast. This has been KM Best with Marvel Snap phenom Brendan APG. Of course, we are audio only this week. Thank you for making it through. I really appreciate it. As always, we'd really appreciate it if you'd leave a review at ratethispodcast.com. We love hearing those reviews. Do we have a review to read out this week, Brendan? Or since you're overseas, we have no reviews?
No review because I'm overseas. Sorry,
we have no reviews. We have no reviews. Brendan is overseas. He's not really able to handle me doing this voice. He's not used to the KMSMR. It's giving him tingles all the way down his spine. He's really, really enjoying it. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Brendan, do you have any final thoughts?
No, that's it. Thank you all so much.
He has no final thoughts. He has nothing left to say. He's been laughing the entire time I'm doing this voice. I don't really get why it's funny, but if I'm getting a good reaction, I'm gonna keep doing it. I don't know.
Bro, did you make up KMSMR on the fly, or is that like something you've
streamed
before?
I've done KMSMR on stream before, which by the way reminds me I should plug my stream. I have no schedule anymore. I just go live at 6 p.m. some days. That's what's happening. I go live at 6 p.m. when I feel like playing Marvel Snap, which is most days of the week. So 6 p.m. Eastern, I'm probably there.
The evolution of a streamer, it's like, okay, I'm this time exactly every day. I'm like, oh, I missed a day. I'm so sorry. And then it just becomes, I'll be on. 6 p.m.
I'll be on.
Maybe.
You can find me. I'll be on playing Marvel Snap. The time has never changed. It's always 6 p.m. That is what it is. It's just straight up 6 p.m. Eastern. That is when I am playing Marvel Snap. But like some days you're just like, oh, I don't have it in me to go for 4 hours. So I'm going to go like eat chicken fingers instead. That's how it goes sometimes.
Awesome. Thank you all so much again. We'll see you next week.
Later.